Hello everyone. Today we will be talking about tantalum capacitors. Now, tantalum capacitors are a very interesting type of capacitor because they deliver the same sorts of capacities as traditional electrolytic capacitors, but they can be in much smaller packages than an electrolytic capacitor while still having massive capacitances. But first of all, well, how do I know that these things are higher capacity than a traditional electrolytic capacitor? Well, it's from the markings. But first, let's take a look at the markings of some other capacitors. So this one right here says, if you can see, 220. And that means that, well, the first two numbers in this code are supposed to that's just the regular value of the capacitor. But then the last number is the multiplier. And it basically just means how many zeros are supposed to be after the first two numbers. So 220 means 22, and then 0 zeros. So that would be 22 picofarad. Capacitors are measured in picofarads. This one, a larger capacitor says 471. So that means 47 and then 1 0 at the end. So this one is 470 picofarad. This one is a bit larger, at least in terms of capacitance. It says 223, so that means 2 and 3 zeros, so that's 22,000 picofarad or 22 nanofarad. This one says 683, so that means 68 and 3 zeros, so 68 nanofarad. This one says 104, so that means 1 0 and then 4 zeros, so that's 100,000 picofarad or 1 nanofarad. Now, let's take a look at some of these tantalum capacitors. This one says 105, so that means 1 0 and then 5 zeros, so this one is 1 microfarad. Now, it's not exactly uncommon for some of the small SMD ceramic capacitors to go up to 10 microfarad, but these tantalum capacitors can go even higher. Let's take a look at this one over here, 106. So that's 1 0 followed by 6 zeros. So 10 microfarad. Then these two large ones, physically at least, this one says 476, so it is 47 microfarad. This one says 227, so it's 220 microfarad. Imagine that, 220 microfarad, just in this tiny package. Let me see if I can find a 220 microfarad capacitor, electrolytic capacitor. Here is a 220 microfarad capacitor, and even though that's, they are about the same sort of height and stuff, but this one, of course, needs to be mounted vertically, which means that it takes up a lot of space above the board, while this one is mounted horizontally. In fact, it's actually a surface mount component, SMD component, so it doesn't stick out of the board nearly as much. This thing has a much better form factor for a capacitor than these bulky electrolytic ones over here. Well, this one isn't really that bulky, but still, it's quite a difference. And also a nice characteristic of these things is that it is significantly harder for them to rot like traditional electrolytic capacitors would. Because these are solid-state capacitors. It's just, there's no liquids inside of here. This thing is sealed. While inside of these electrolytic capacitors, the reason that they have such a high capacitance is because between the plates of the capacitor, there is a paper which is soaked with a special liquid, which it's an electrolyte, and basically by some weird physics effects, the molecules in it rotate or something, and it gives the capacitor extra capacitance. Doesn't really make all that much sense to me, but it gives it a high capacitance. But as the capacitor ages, it heats up and dries out, then all of that electrolyte degrades and evaporates through the gaps in the seals of the capacitor, and so it loses much of its capacitance, and also its equivalent series resistance goes up significantly, which makes it a worse capacitor. It can't smooth the same sorts of ripple currents that a fresh capacitor could. And because tantalum capacitors are completely solid, they don't suffer from that issue, and so they're basically immune to that. However, I am not entirely sure about the voltage ratings of these things because, they are quite small, and you can get electrolytic capacitors that can have quite high voltages. For example, this one over here, it's absolutely massive, but it's 200 volts, 82 microfarad. But these tantalum capacitors, I'm not really sure about the voltage ratings. The electrolytic capacitors always have a voltage rating. This one right here is 16 volts. This one right here is 25 volts. This one right here is also 16 volts. This one right here is 50 volts. But for all of these non-electrolytic capacitors, they don't really seem to specify a voltage rating unless you're really into some high voltage stuff. Like, for example, this capacitor over here, this is actually a class Y capacitor with some tiny label over there, and it has some certifications and stuff. And this thing is, if I can get it to focus, it is 440 volt X1, 440 volt Y1. So yeah, this thing is rated for 440 volts, but it can handle actually much more than that. This one right here is just rated 1 kilovolt. Yeah, these all of these non-electrolytic capacitors, it seems like they don't really specify a voltage rating unless you get to some of the high voltage stuff. But these the electrolytic capacitors always have a voltage rating, but these tantalum capacitors, unfortunately, they do not specify a voltage rating, because I'm fairly certain that you can't like pump 100 volts into these things and they'll just stay normal. But anyway, let's go ahead and prove that these little capacitors can indeed work just like the regular electrolytic capacitors. So let's go ahead and put a voltmeter over here, actually multimeter, and set it to the 200 kiloohm range. And as we take a look at the numbers on the screen, let's go ahead and connect this capacitor over here, although I should probably get some different probes. These clip-on probes are much better for clipping onto pins and stuff. So let's go ahead and find that little capacitor and charge it. Here it is. Let's hook it up. So as you can see, the capacitor slowly charges. It was already pre-charged a bit before, so let's go ahead and short it out to discharge it, and now you can see it slowly charging. This is not the voltage on the capacitor or anything like that. This is just the perceived resistance that this thing is measuring. But basically, as the capacitor charges, less and less current can flow into that, and so the multimeter interprets that as a higher and higher resistance until it eventually charges enough that the resistance goes off the scale. So let's go ahead and discharge that. And now let's take a look at the tantalum capacitor. So it's going to be a bit harder to hook this up. And what I should mention is that the electrolytic capacitors, they're polarized, so if you connect them backwards, they won't exactly work correctly. And the electrolytic capacitors always mark the negative with a stripe over here, while the tantalum capacitors mark the positive with a stripe. So that's very important and a little bit confusing when you are designing stuff and putting stuff together. So let's go ahead and see if I can hook up my probes to the tantalum capacitor. This is quite a janky setup, I have to say. So let's make sure that the capacitor is discharged first. There you go. Now let's connect the probe. And now you can see the multimeter charging the capacitor. And it appears to be rising at just about the same rate as the electrolytic capacitor. So tantalum capacitors have many benefits over the electrolytic capacitors, but then how come they aren't used very often? Well, electrolytic capacitors are absolutely dirt cheap. They can be found in just about everything. They've been produced for the past 60 years, maybe even longer, and we have really perfected the design of these things to get them smaller and cheaper. But tantalum capacitors, they are a bit newer. They were probably invented in like the late 70s or 80s or something like that. And even though that we've probably had some experience manufacturing these little things, they are still quite expensive. I haven't actually checked the prices of these things yet, but I have heard from videos and stuff that tantalum capacitors can get quite expensive, and that's why they aren't typically used. However, in higher-end electronics where most of the stuff is surface mount and or all of the stuff is surface mount, tantalum capacitors can actually appear quite often because of their low profile. And SMD electrolytic capacitors do exist. Here's an example of one. It's basically a little metal can, but with pins which are more rectangular cross-section instead of circular, and there's this little plastic base plate to just keep them steady and prevent them from shorting out with the metal can. But these things are quite rare, and typically you will find tantalum capacitors as SMD capacitors in various electronics. And in fact, I actually desoldered these capacitors from some old refrigerant gas detector circuit board, and yes. Before you ask, I am so down bad that I am desoldering SMD components. I know it's sad, but you know what? You gotta do what you gotta do. Anyway, I think that's about enough rambling about tantalum capacitors.